So that was Juan Gabriel. He's a Mexican pop icon who is a queer Mexican pop icon, and it's the music that really I grew up with as a kid. So it's rumored that that song was a song about him going to a disco in Juarez, Mexico, El Noa Noa. But in that line, in that song, it has a line that says, where everybody is welcome. And so it was rumored that Juan Gabriel was gay. He was a big part of my life growing up, interestingly enough. I actually was at his final concert as well in Los Angeles. It's kind of sad. My cousin at her quinceañera, she had a Juan Gabriel impersonator. That's how much he was part of my life. And that's me at my goal weight there in 1986. But I grew up first-generation Mexican-American. I grew up in a very cultural family. And we had a lot of queer icons as a kid. You might know some of these individuals. The first gentleman there on the left is Juan Gabriel, or Juan Gabriel. We had Walter Mercado. We had Rocío Dúrcal, which was a Spanish singer who was also a friend of us gays in the Latin world. So I say that because I was thinking about how to start this presentation and how many different ways we identify as individuals. And I really thought music was an interesting take, only because we were asked to kind of introduce our walk-up song, but also I hear music as a common theme today. Music festivals, the importance of music. As a marketer and advertiser, music is very important to culture, and I thought this graphic was really interesting in terms of when you look at Hispanic and Black consumers specifically, of the association of music with being part of a good family. Especially for bicultural Hispanics in this case, which is certainly the point for me. LGBTQ similar. There's a WeHo Pride happening right now in Los Angeles, my hometown. And that's, LA Pride was criticized a few years ago for becoming a music festival. And there's a reason for that, right? So people from different cultures, people identify with things that they value and motivate them. So I'm going to, keeping on the music trend here, I'm going to introduce some concepts that have been controversial in the past. One specifically I got in hot water here in Florida for using a couple years back. These terms of intersectionality, culture, authenticity, I've heard it a lot today. And I worked for a tour operator a few years ago where we can use the word authenticity because it was overplayed and it meant nothing to anybody. And that's false. Authenticity is really important when you talk about the intersection of culture, especially within LGBTQ communities and underrepresented communities and consumers. And culture is really key. I'll talk a little bit about the importance of brands and destinations and making sure that you're in tune with the culture of your consumers and your target market. But most importantly is this concept of intersectionality. I just told you about my intersectional experience growing up first generation Mexican-American, growing up gay, and having this identity where if I hear that song, if I see that artist, it means something to me, I connect. I used this example a few years ago, many years ago now, I was still listening to the FM dial. I heard the first ever bilingual ad on the radio. And I don't listen to ads on the radio, but I perked up. I was like, wow, that guy sounds like me. Talk about sonic diversity. I perked up, I listened. It was an insurance ad. I didn't buy it, but it was significant in that I understood they understood me. They did their research and their homework. And this is important. Why? I think yesterday you heard about the browning of America. 100% of the population growth in the past 10 years is multicultural, right? 30% growth in the census, by the way, which is really flawed, undercounted in many places, including the South. But 30% growth of AAPI, Asian Americans, mostly through immigration, 20% for Hispanics, natural born, not immigration, right? We had 13% Black growth in population identity. We also had, as you guys know, 7%. Gallup poll saying 7% of Americans now consider themselves or identify as LGBTQ+. But they get 6 in 10 Gen Z youngsters saying that they identify as such. So the population is growing, and why as marketers we need to but focus on this is really because that's the future market. That's a demand that's coming, and I think a better connection between values and cultures and motivators and the messages we're deploying is really key here. In terms of the LGBTQ audience, it's 18.5 million, and 40% of those, or of us, should I say, are people of color. So intersectional things happening here between a growing population which is becoming more and more LGBTQ, more brown. And we can't discount the power of the spend. In my previous role with MMGY Global, I helped lead some research that really talked about the power and the spend of Black and Hispanic travelers, which hadn't been done before. And it's significant when you look at the overlap here that might exist between the 458 million overnight trips by LGBTQ+, you add Indigenous, you add Black, you add Hispanic, you add AAPI. Huge market there. I want to thank MMGY because I literally got this data 2 days ago. They've just releasing the summer edition of the Portrait of the American Traveler. And I want to give kudos to them because I think a lot of the research companies in our travel space are not doing enough to continue to understand emerging travelers. But the reason I launched Culturist was this reason here. And so I was curious. I helped them actually develop this question before I left my role there in December. And I was curious to see how this is tracking, right? So the percent of people who agree that ethnic diversity and multicultural population of a destination is influential in terms of wanting to see themselves represented in that experience is high for people of color, for LGBTQ+. And that's why it matters that obviously we're having this conversation today about intersectionality. So back to one of the icons and the trip that I took, which I started to think about. I really did take my mom to a bunch of drag shows and to Madrid. And there were so many things at play there, right? Taking her to our native land, dismiss the colonial, problematic part of that. But, a country that our family came from, she knew the language, knew the culture. And then we were at the Chueca district, which is where this really old pictures, like iPhone 4 pictures. Took her to a drag bar, really risque, but really interesting because I wanted to show her my full identity, and she was there for it. She was appreciative of it. That week also, by the way, was Madrid Bear Week. And so when I pointed out to her what bears were and that we were in Madrid at this time, she said, "Mijo, do you want to go hang out with your friends now?" Which I thought was hilarious. And I'm like, "No, Mom, I'm not here for Madrid Bear Week, although maybe." So even in the Latinx community, and I use that term interchangeably, by the way, Hispanic Latinx, the research showed that 80% of Hispanics use the term Hispanic, only about 3% Latinx, right? Non-binary term to describe who I am. I prefer to use it because I respect the non-binary community. So 2.3 million Latinx LGBT adults in the United States. 65% are 35 and younger, right? So the browning of America, and obviously a big population of LGBTQ folks as well. I threw some stats on here. I won't bore you, but the takeaway really is we feel connected to our community. Family is important to us. We value our culture. We want to interact with people who are like us. And so that's where Culturist Group kind of was born out of, right? Helping travel exist where culture meets brand. And that bad word sometimes, culture, when you talk about the idea of culture, it's not. It's the way that we basically, again, have connections and support connections with each other, with our families, our communities, with the brands that we frequent, with destinations that we go to. I think it's really important also here that this is an economic imperative for a lot of destinations and brands who are struggling to answer the questions that's been asked on this stage a lot today. How do you prioritize, right? And the thing that I'm looking at and realizing is that a lot of the values are very similar. When you look at Gen Z, even non-Hispanic white Gen Z or millennials, or you're looking at people of color, right? What are those things? Wanting to be seen, wanting to be respected, wanting to feel safe, right? Representation of their culture and who they are and their values are really important when they're interacting with brands. And I argue that culture is king and culture is queen for a very real purpose. And I've been looking outside of the travel and tourism industry for data that talks about how making sure that brand marketing and messaging is reflecting all of these things here. Representation, there's that A word again, authenticity, identification, respect. The role models that we have, Juan Gabriel singing El Noa Noa, right? The way that marketers can use those things to deploy messages is really important. And also, it works. When you look at the lift in brand relevance and purchase intent and loyalty, these things are working. So, a few takeaways, right? We are growing, As a population, we are younger, we are diverse, we want to celebrate our culture, but more importantly, we want you, meaning destinations, travel, and tourism, to celebrate our culture as well. And those have very, very different intersectional ways of doing that. So this is a marketing conference at heart. I know that Will wants to make sure that we walk away with how, right? And we heard a lot of great speakers today. Matt, everybody here has been doing great work. I'm kind of new to the LGBTQ marketing space, but I want to be more engaged and involved because of my personal identity. But I want to provide some solutions in terms of pathways forward, right? So many times as we look at these, overextended marketing budgets, we're looking at travel intent, right? Who's going to come to our destination? Who's going to drive here? What's the drive market? We heard this article with all the great information on target markets and segmentation. But really, it's taking a step back and understanding the multicultural consumer. Again, along values, along authentic, cues, authentic messages, and pushing also research and data providers to provide more, right? So utilizing these insights to build multicultural roadmaps. A lot of time, I think, in our industry, we look at endemic travel data, visitation patterns, visitation, preferences. There was a couple of questions asked about how do you know if some of these consumers are LGBTQ or Black or brown, and our industry still has a ways to go to figure out who's coming to our destination, right? How are we catering to that group and audience? So we need to ask questions of our data providers, of the industry, the same way I'm doing of a lot of these folks. And my clients who are saying, well, I'm using XYZ company, great. How effective are they at telling you who's coming and what they're preferencing? And I know it's a big question David's asking today, too, of everybody on stage. The brand strategy is really important, and I see a lot of work happening already. Communify has been mentioned a couple of times. It's really important to look at the brand strategy before going into marketing campaign and planning to make sure it's inclusive. In my work at MMGY, we did some great destination work with Destination Cleveland, for example, who was looking at to basically remove systemic racism from the way they had done marketing through personas, through their audiences, through the products and experiences they were recommending in their community. And again, the importance of community has been obviously stressed today, but making sure that when you're reflecting community that it's inclusive and comprehensive in the way that you're talking about your destination. And that's all part of the brand strategy. Not creating separate messages or separate platforms for it, but making sure that the strategy itself is not leaving anybody out. And creating compelling, responsible, and culturally relevant messages, getting down to the tactical part of it now, is really relying on community. So connecting people, culture, and message is a tagline that I use for Culturist Group. And the important part of that is that you're understanding who lives in your communities and who your target markets are so you can develop these and deploy these messages at appropriate times. Everywhere. Not just on social, not just on blogs or content or podcasts, but everywhere, including your brand marketing, your brand spots. I'm seeing some great examples. I still see a lot of LGBTQ campaigns made just for YouTube or made just for programmatic video, for very targeted marketing. Let everybody know who you are and how you're going to connect with those audiences. So a couple of things about the Culturist Group, and I think I'm wrapping up here. I talk really fast. Is really kind of helping destinations and travel brands do the work through inclusive readiness audits, looking at the full kind of omnichannel marketing plan, media plans, making sure that we're bringing in the research that is necessary to understand each of these segments, a roadmap as well, not only for LGBTQ+, but again, how these values intersect with each other, and then the briefs, which are really important for the agencies of record and the creative agencies who are deploying the work in terms of what are the things that you're not looking at or seeing. Where I'm from in California, 40% of the population now is now Hispanic. And I'll tell you, I kind of one hand when I see actually destinations and DMOs developing campaigns for Hispanic families or Hispanic travelers out there. It's very generic still. Not to dig on my own state, we're doing pretty well in the scheme of things. But all that to say is that there's a lot of room for growth and understanding about how to build multicultural elements into the way you deploy messages. That's it for me. Thank you so much. I encourage you to follow me, please, on Instagram, LinkedIn. I have a little newsletter that comes out every now and then. You can subscribe at culturistgroup.com. Thank you.
Give it up for Danny. Have a sit.
Great.
That was nice of your mom to let you go to the Bear Festival. She sounds like one heck of a gal.
She's amazing.
This is your prezzo touched on a lot of different things, and it's interesting that we're wrapping up. We've got one session left. A quick one with this, and this touches on something I just said in the previous group and yesterday, this browning and graying of America.
Right.
And it seems like you are poised to really capitalize on that. Can you talk us through how you would talk a brand through addressing that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, again, is really looking at the idea here is for DMO specifically, or travel brands, is not to dismantle the brands they built, which are valuable. It's to really kind of ask questions of the data that they're using and the research they're using to deploy their messaging and their marketing.
Let me pick on that a minute. Not to dismantle the brand that they already have. Talk me through what you mean by that exactly.
Sure. I think, right now in the DEI space, and certainly I think a lot of my advocacy for this work comes from a DEI lens, is to, look at things again, maybe break them up a little bit, go back to the drawing board on things. And I'm not advocating for that. I think the more important thing is to actually look at mostly the research and the data that's kind of fueling decision making. And I found along the way that, for example, a lot of the research that I'm using here, I'm having to ask 2 or 3 layers in, okay, well, 30% of travelers are saying this, but how are brown travelers responding to this information? How are indigenous travelers reacting to this statement? And so a lot of it has to come in through the inputs that are really informing decisions on media buys, media placements, creative execution, social media campaigns. So it really is, I think, a methodical process of starting with research and data, as I said.
And talk me through your process. How big is the Culturist group?
It's me.
Okay. And so when you do some sort of deep dive, where are you outsourcing the data collection? How does this work?
So luckily, I mean, my experience is 20 years in DMO marketing, travel marketing, hospitality marketing. And previously, I was at agency side for 10 years. So what I'm doing through is really kind of going through a client strategy, going through a marketing plan, going through even the agency's briefs to really help handhold, really, through the process of, like, tell me about your input, tell me about the data you're using to define your target markets, tell me about, the execution plan for the fall campaign, the spring campaign, and how can we actually back up a little bit and make sure that those things are resonating with this multicultural, intersectional audience that you're trying to reach. Or even define it, because a lot of people still aren't there yet in terms of knowing how to do that.
Right.
Or allocating resources for, let's say, Black travelers versus, Hispanic travelers.
Right. Hispanic, Latinx, you use those terms interchangeably.
I do, yes.
You do, okay. Are there breakdowns for usage by platform of the Hispanic Latinx as a proportion of the larger population?
The only data point I have on that is the overall traveling population for the research done for Visas Latinas, which is the MMGY study you can purchase on their website, was in regards to self-identification of travelers.
Okay.
And typically what you found was that non-LGBTQ identifying individuals prefer the term Hispanic. People who were bilingual or bicultural prefer the term Latino or Latina. So with the immigrant population, which is a consideration for multi-generational folks, if you have parents or grandparents whose Spanish is their primary language, they're still using different terms. Their comfort level with...
And they have older terms, too.
Older terms, exactly. And different experiences in travel.
Yeah.
One of the things we found was regarding discrimination. I think it was 4 out of 10, people who were researched, Hispanic travelers, talked about discrimination because of the color of their skin, their accent, things of that nature. So it's really interesting research, but I don't think it's taken into consideration. There's not enough of it. I've been working with a TTRA, Travel Tourism Research Association, to help them kind of, come up with a library or build a library of research in the space that can be a bit more useful for destinations and brands.
Laura from Sirius was up here a while ago talking about sonic diversity and about having those type of things. If I'm a DMO or I'm a space that really wants to address the Hispanic market, what are the first steps?
Well, first of all, is understanding, again, your feeder market. So at the end of the day, it's not a matter of kind of, reinventing the wheel or going after markets that are not going to be viable because of drive distances or flight distances. Right. In California, we have a large population of Hispanics in the state. A lot of it is maintaining those demographic market segments or focus areas, but also kind of deploying, again, the messages, the language, and the cultural cues that are going to relate to those, for example, Hispanic families coming down to visit Carlsbad, which is a client I'm working with now. That's a really important consideration for them because in the past, where the campaigns have been somewhat generic, how do we not use language? The execution of language, bilingual executions, or even imagery, of course, assets that show Hispanic families to cater to that segment more than we have before. And to my point earlier, it's a lot of the emerging travelers understand that they want to transact with brands and destinations who are being inclusive. So by using Hispanic families in the advertising, it's not detracting from their own experience or desire to go there.
So it's allowing a Hispanic traveler to see themselves in the advertising of any specific
Correct.
destination or
Correct.
product.
And part of that is building trust,
Right.
which is a big barrier, I think, to also growing market share with some communities, underrepresented communities, because the trust is in there, the confidence is in there. Meaning, if you've never marketed to me before, how do I know that I'm going to be welcome there?
Right. How important is it to have a bilingual campaign if you're an American destination, or does it depend on the destination?
It depends on the destination and it depends on your target market profile. Mm-hmm. Because we find that 80% of individuals, especially millennials and Gen Z, are speaking English, but speaking in Spanish within their social circles or at home. And it's not a primary language, but if you really want to get in there, using my radio example,
right,
and relate to somebody, you'll have a bilingual execution. Not for the purposes of running all Spanish language media on Univision or whatever it is, for the purposes of understanding that you understand that culture in that segment.
And this is a guess, because I have some dear friends who are Hispanic, and they grew up, and I grew up very closely with them. The prevalence, and to this day, the prevalence and usage of Spanglish at home. Right.
Yes.
Does that ever cross over into actual ads or spaces where
it does in the consumer space?
Yeah.
A lot of Spanglish is used in consumer space, especially now with music, with musical acts. Bad Bunny and all the people who are really kind of influential with younger generations. It's really, really spectacular use of language in that way. I think Puerto Rico is doing a great job with Boricua. I've mentioned this before because they have the product and they're the destination. But other brands can do that as well. Florida itself has a high Hispanic population. Texas, California, we're all not monolithic, right? The population comes from whether it's Mexico or Puerto Rico or Colombia, but there's opportunities there to be a little bit more effective in the way that you market using language.
And I get it in the cultural space with the performers and artists, but in a promotional space, would you be going on to thin ice if you try to do something in Spanglish?
Not if it's culturally relevant and appropriate and respectful. And that's why I think the guidance is so needed in this area, because you can't just deploy, tokenizing campaigns or performative things that aren't really part of the brand. It goes back to who your brand is.
Sure.
If you're doing these things in the absence of having a really inclusive brand strategy, then it's not being authentic.
And you probably know this stat off the top of your head. I can only guess it, but the year by which most of America, the majority of America, will not be white.
About 2030 to 2040.
Okay. And that, as a marketer, as someone who's planning ahead, as a brand, as anything, what should people be thinking about right now? Or should they? Is that just a natural evolution of where we're going? Is it going to require some repositioning starting now? And any very top-of-line advice on that?
Well, wearing my DEI hat, one of the things is obviously making sure that the team is diverse, right? From your staff internally, your agencies, the people deciding on your campaigns, on your research, on how your brand will present itself need to be diverse. You need to have a vested interest in your destination and your product. It's not about waiting until 2030 or 40, though. I argue that there's a lot of money being left on the table by not catering to the Black travel audience, the intersectional audience, the Hispanic audience. It was $130+ billion in spend the Black travel community had. I think it was $133 billion for Hispanics. So the opportunity is there. And what you're finding in the research, if you look at it further, is a lot of going back to the same places that they grew up visiting. A lot of comfort, right? Well, we know Disneyland, or we know this place, or we go back to family reunions, and all these destinations trying to grow overnight visitation aren't necessarily tapping into that because they've never been present, right, in the homes of Hispanic families or Black families, or have grown that trust. So building trust starts now, has to start now. And that happens through being inclusive, and happens through making sure that your team and your destination is truly understanding and applying the principles of DEI, which I think is really important.
Immigration notwithstanding, through generational growth in the U.S. of Hispanic families, do you get a sense, is Spanish growing in number of speakers, or after a generation or two, is it become an assimilation toward English? Do you have any specs on that?
It's really funny because what I've seen in the research is older generations who are more likely to speak Spanish didn't because of feeling like they were being discriminated against or were missing out on opportunities here in the U.S.
They wanted to come across as American, right?
Correct. Younger generations are resentful of that. So the opposite has happened. They lean into it. They want to listen to Juan Gabriel. They want to go. They want to understand where they're from. They want to do the things that matter to their culture. They want to revisit that. Young millennial parents are wanting to show their own children experiences that relate to where they're from and who they are. And so, to answer your question, it's complicated because it's not. I never grew up learning formal Spanish. It was Spanglish. I didn't speak formal Spanish until I actually started going to Mexico for business travel, and people were, obviously I looked like I'm from there, so they were starting to question why my Spanish was so bad, and that's why I did it. But multiculturalism, bilingualism, whether it's in the Asian community, AAPI, or in Hispanic or any immigrant-based population, is really important because it gives us a clue that you understand who we are and how we function.
When you see an ad aimed at you as a gay Hispanic person of color, do you rank it in importance of I get the sense that this is aimed at me more as a gay person or more as a Hispanic person. Does that ever come across to you in what you do specifically? Because it seems like you'd be analyzing things.
I don't see those ads often.
Right.
Or when I see them, I know too much.
And I guess what I'm getting at is should brands have a ranking order in which one they're appealing to more?
Absolutely.
You understand what I'm getting at, right?
Absolutely. And there is a prioritization that has to happen regarding who you're going after. If you all of a sudden understand that maybe your LGBTQ targeting, a gay male targeting has been predominantly white or just black, and you're missing out on Hispanics, that's an opportunity for you to relate on much more than just having two Hispanic guys making out on the beach. It relates to more. I mean, the reason I showed my mom in the travel experience was like, what would it be like if 40% of millennials were saying they're traveling with their families? What would a campaign look like the Palm Springs example, where there was two gay men and their children, but except now it's their mom or their tia, right? So all of a sudden it's like, well, I would do that. My husband's, we've taken, his mom to the Abbey before for drinks. So, and not all of us, but the 40% of us that see that and say, you get it. Like, this is actually how I live my gay life. And we're not monolithic either, right? I love a gay club as much as the next gay, but I also have family that I care about. And so I think dissecting these data points and making sure that we're understanding where the opportunities are is the way you cut through.
So in the Culturist group, and culture is, talk me through just the Culturist group, because that's an interesting word for me, given what you're doing here.
Yeah, so the Culturist I came up with because it's the devotee or advocate of culture.
Okay.
Not culture in the way that you define culture at the workplace or the way that culture is being weaponized these days in this country. But culture as a means to connecting to people authentically for who they are.
And that's a terrific answer, because you're right. Culture has been weaponized to some degree, and it's one of those words now. It's like a culture wars, culture this, but culturist is it sounds like a column in New York Magazine, the Culturist. I'm going to draw a comparison here, and I want you to debunk it or say yes or no or anything you want with it. There seems to be, in America at least, a very stark and very pronounced differentiation between the soft power and the economic power of minority groups. If you look at Black Americans and you look at the soft power, the power through culture and sports and other things that the African Americans exist in the United States versus the economic power of African Americans. Do you see a similarity among Hispanics? And if so, do you think there's a correlation there?
I don't think the Hispanic culture or population here is nearly as, I think, understood or appreciated. And I think it's because we are an immigrant-based population that has very different preferences, whether if you live in Florida or you live in California or Texas or Chicago. I think that the Hispanic community, those of us in leadership positions, which is why I started this thing, needs to be a better job about explaining what we need and what we need to see. I guess I don't understand your question between soft power and
the soft powers in power in culture and sports, and like America's famous for having soft power all over the world because Americans are famous in movie stars and famous in music and famous in art and famous in the arts and designer and all this other stuff. So I'm saying I believe there could be a case made for a differentiation or a distinction between the soft power of a culture and the economic power of a culture. And it seems like Hispanic culture has a very strong soft power in American culture right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's growing, definitely. And I think when you look at why and how, a lot of it's cultural, right? Based, it's music.
Right.
A lot of it's identity along music and food.
And sports.
And sports, which is hugely important, especially to Hispanic travelers. But it shouldn't be seen as a commodity either. Because increasingly the people who are doing the purchasing look like me. So in essence, then, we can't kind of just say, we're going to take that, kind of package it up and put it back in your face. It goes to the question of inclusivity, right? And building a more inclusive industry so that those in the positions of power and influence who are, kind of deploying campaigns and building product and building awareness for the destination are the ones that are reflecting that culture.
And turning that soft power into strong economic power.
Correct, or converting it. Because that's one of the things that I see is, we tried a campaign 2 years ago to target Hispanics or Black families, and it didn't work. And I said, show me how you've been building your brand. Show me your first-party data collection. Show me your first-party data strategy for how you're trying to understand and build, kind of the brand equity amongst this community. Well, we did one campaign with an influencer, and we had them on the cover of the visitor's guide. It's typically what I hear. See Sophia nodding her head. It's just not enough, and it's not going to happen overnight because building trust is really important. The research shows, especially people of color, it's just not overnight, right? People take, our communities take to word of mouth recommendations more than trusting, TripAdvisor, Expedia, whatever it is. And so we need to make sure that we're building and including these communities and these consumers into the pipeline of what we're trying to build for economic prosperity.
Yeah, and you said it so well. It's not to be treated as a monolith. Like any other group, it is as diverse as any other group.
Correct.
When you think of in Florida, for example, when you think of the Hispanic culture, when you think of Miami, you think there's a very strong sense of political conservatism there.
Sure.
Which in some senses is surprising, and other places it's the opposite as well. You also said something just a while ago that I want to end with you on. Will, are we ready for our next session? All right, great. Let's go back to authenticity for just a minute because, and it's funny, Matt said something, and I didn't get a chance to read it. Matt, I'm going to read it now because I just noticed it when we were sitting still. It was your quote. And Matt would be happy to see the word authentic banned from destination marketing.
Oh, Matt, come on.
Which I love. Because, there was a time where we were just authentic to death, right? We had to be authentic about everything. But you have breathed new life back into it. Can you talk us through that just one?
There's a few things that I've found in my kind of advocacy work and research that really kind of made me upset. One was this idea that we're all the same. And, we shouldn't try to divide people. And authenticity is not important because that's trite and overused. And I think for me, that was a little bit of minimizing the importance of both of those things. Because I think, being a person of color, professional of color in this industry for 20 plus years, I've always sat in that boardroom and thought to myself, they just don't get me. I just don't see myself. I just don't understand how that campaign is actually drawing people like me closer to this brand. So authenticity has a big part of that. I kind of showed some of the examples of kind of what authenticity means is relating to, and going back to your previous comment regarding that we're not monolithic. People who live in Florida, Texas, California may have differences, but there's a few truths that are there, right? Regarding how much we value family,
right,
and music, and culture, and our identity.
Food.
And food, which, by the way, I think Hispanic travelers spent more on food. I think the first one was transportation, second was food, third was accommodations. Typically, it's the other way around. So I think that those things need to be revisited because I think we've kind of thrown the baby out with the bathwater a little bit and saying, well, these things are trite and overused and not important. Well, they actually are important to the people who are are going to be, wielding the economic power in the next 10, 20 years.
Well, that was awesome. I so enjoyed your presentation. I wish you the best of luck with Culturist Group. How long have you been this?
I launched on January 31st.
Right on. Well, we look forward to updates from you at future Thrive conferences. Please give it up for Danny Guerrero.
Thank you.